Some of the most fascinating places ever built are hiding where almost nobody thinks to look. Beneath the ground, inside mountains, across forgotten islands, and in landscapes that seem completely ordinary today, ancient people left behind cities, temples, tombs, fortresses, and monuments that survived thousands of years. Tonight, we're traveling across the ancient world to uncover some of these forgotten places. From an underground necropolis in Malta and a Maya cave filled with paintings, to lost cities carved into cliffs, mysterious stone monuments in the Andes, and ancient settlements hidden beneath the European landscape. Some were abandoned, some were buried, and some survived only because the landscapes around them protected them from time. As we move from one site to the next, we'll uncover the people who built them, the worlds they lived in, and the mysteries that archaeologists are still trying to understand. Make sure to subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Now, let's begin our journey. The island Sultanate built with coral, off the coast of Tanzania, on a small island surrounded by the Indian Ocean. The ruins of a powerful medieval city still stand. Stone walls, mosques, palaces, tombs, and enormous buildings made from something that seems almost impossible for monumental architecture. Coral. This was Kilwa Kisiwani, a wealthy island sultanate that once controlled one of the most important trading networks along the East African coast. Kilwa Kisiwani lies just off the coast of southern Tanzania, but centuries ago, it was connected to a much larger world. Ships arrived from Arabia, Persia, India, and other parts of the Indian Ocean. They carried ceramics, textiles, metal goods, and luxury products. In return, East Africa supplied valuable commodities from the interior. Kilwa became especially wealthy through its control of the gold trade. Gold from the regions farther south moved toward the coast, and from Kilwa, it could be shipped across the Indian Ocean. The city became one of the most important commercial centers in medieval East Africa. But Kilwa's wealth was not only visible in its trade, it was built into the city itself. The island contains the remains of stone houses, public buildings, mosques, palaces, and tombs. Many were constructed from coral rag, a building material created from ancient coral limestone. The material was practical, but it could also produce surprisingly impressive architecture. Builders cut coral blocks into manageable pieces, then carefully arranged them into walls. Over generations, these techniques produced some of the most distinctive architecture on the Swahili coast. One of the most remarkable buildings is the Great Mosque of Kilwa. Its earliest sections date back many centuries, and later rulers expanded the complex. The mosque became one of the most important religious buildings on the Swahili coast. Its surviving arches, columns, and coral walls still reveal the scale of the medieval city. Nearby, the remains of the Husuni Kubwa Palace stretch across the island. The enormous complex included courtyards, rooms, and monumental spaces overlooking the ocean. It was built during Kilwa's period of greatest prosperity, when the Sultanate had become a major power in Indian Ocean trade. Imagine approaching Kilwa centuries ago. The island would have been surrounded by sailing vessels, merchants arriving from distant ports, and local traders carrying goods between the coast and the interior. The harbor would have been filled with activity. Inside the city, coral buildings would have risen above narrow streets. Kilwa was part of the wider Swahili civilization, a network of coastal communities stretching along East Africa. These cities shared language, trade connections, religious traditions, and architectural styles, but each developed its own political identity. Kilwa eventually became one of the most powerful among them. Islam was deeply connected with the city's development. Mosques were constructed. Islamic burial traditions became part of the landscape, and Kilwa's merchants participated in a commercial world that stretched across the Muslim Indian Ocean. The city was African, but it was also deeply connected to distant cultures. Archaeological discoveries show just how far those connections reached. Ceramics from China and the Islamic world have been found at Kilwa, along with other imported goods. These objects reveal that the city was not an isolated island settlement. It was part of a vast maritime economy. The ocean was effectively Kilwa's highway. Ships could carry goods across enormous distances, following seasonal monsoon winds. Merchants understood these patterns, traveling with the winds at particular times of the year, and returning when the winds changed. This gave Kilwa an enormous advantage. The city stood in a perfect position for controlling trade between the African interior, the Swahili coast, and the wider Indian Ocean. Its wealth depended on these connections. But prosperity also created competition. Other coastal cities wanted control over the same trade routes, and political power shifted over time. Kilwa's influence eventually weakened. Then, in the 16th century, Portuguese forces arrived along the East African coast. The old trading system began to change. Kilwa was eventually occupied and its political importance declined. The wealthy city that had once dominated regional trade was gradually abandoned. Buildings deteriorated, roofs collapsed, and vegetation began taking over the ruins. The coral walls remained, but the people who had created them disappeared. For centuries, the island became a quiet archaeological landscape. The remains of the Sultanate stood among trees and coastal vegetation, surrounded by the same ocean that had once made the city wealthy. Modern archaeology eventually revealed more of Kilwa's story. Excavations uncovered imported ceramics, coins, buildings, burials, and evidence of everyday life. Together, they showed that the city had been far more sophisticated than its ruined appearance suggested. Perhaps the most fascinating part is the contrast. Today, Kilwa Kisiwani can feel remote and peaceful, but centuries ago, it was connected to some of the most important trading centers on Earth. Ships from distant countries reached its harbor, merchants exchanged goods, and enormous coral buildings announced the power of the Sultanate. Kilwa Kisiwani is remarkable because an island that now appears quiet was once at the center of a global trading network. Its wealth came from the ocean, its power came from trade, and its buildings were constructed largely from the coral limestone of the surrounding coast. The sultans are gone, the merchants have disappeared, and the ships no longer crowd the harbor, but the coral walls remain, standing beneath the East African sun, as reminders of an island city that once connected Africa with the wider medieval world. The Buddhist caves hidden in the Mumbai Hills. Inside the green hills of northern Mumbai, hundreds of caves have been carved directly into the dark volcanic rock. Some contain enormous halls, others hold quiet meditation cells, and some preserve inscriptions and sculptures left by people who lived here more than 1,000 years ago. This is Kanheri, one of the largest and most remarkable Buddhist cave complexes in India. Kanheri lies within what is now Sanjay Gandhi National Park, a surprising location for an ancient religious center. Today, the caves are surrounded by one of India's busiest cities, but when the first monks began carving into these hills, the landscape would have been very different. Dense forests surrounded the settlement, and streams provided water during the monsoon. The earliest activity at Kanheri probably began around the 1st century BC, and the complex continued developing for many centuries. Generation after generation, monks expanded the settlement, carving new rooms, new shrines, and larger halls into the hillside. What began as a small religious community eventually became a vast monastic center. More than 100 caves are spread across the rocky slopes. Some are extremely simple: a small doorway, a narrow room, and a stone bench where a monk could rest or meditate. Others are much more elaborate. They contain columns, sculptures, religious images, and large ceremonial spaces. One of the most impressive is Cave 3, a huge Buddhist prayer hall known as a chaitya. A long row of stone columns runs along both sides, leading toward a large stupa at the far end. The entire chamber was carved from the living rock. There was no separate stone building. The mountain itself became the temple. Imagine entering this hall centuries ago. The outside world would disappear behind you. The light would become softer, and the sound of footsteps would echo between the stone columns. At the far end, the stupa would stand in the darkness. Monks and visitors could walk around it as part of their religious practice. The builders also created something particularly practical: water systems. Kanheri receives heavy monsoon rainfall, and the ancient inhabitants learned how to collect and control it. Rock-cut channels, cisterns, and reservoirs were carved into the hillside. Rainwater could be collected and stored, providing the community with an important supply throughout the year. Some of these cisterns are remarkably well preserved. Their existence reveals that Kanheri was not simply a collection of temples. It was a functioning settlement. People had to eat, drink, sleep, study, and maintain the buildings. The caves supported an entire monastic community. Many caves contained simple living spaces. Stone beds were carved directly into the walls, giving monks a place to sleep. There were also spaces for teaching, meditation, and religious gatherings. The settlement therefore combined private rooms with large communal areas. Kanheri also preserves evidence of a much wider world. Inscriptions found throughout the caves record donations, names, religious associations, and the people who supported the monastery. Some donors were merchants. Others were local officials or wealthy individuals. Their contributions helped the complex grow. This connection with trade was important. Kanheri was not far from the ancient ports of the western Indian coast. Merchants traveling between the interior and the Arabian Sea could pass through the region. The monastery therefore existed within a network of commerce and movement. Buddhist monasteries often benefited from these trade routes. Travelers could stop at religious centers, make donations, and seek shelter during journeys. In return, monasteries became places where ideas and traditions could travel. Kanheri was part of that larger network. Over the centuries, the religious character of the caves changed. Early Buddhist traditions at the site were eventually joined by later forms of Buddhist art and worship. Sculptures of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas became increasingly common. The caves therefore preserve several different stages of Buddhist history. Some sculptures are especially impressive. Large figures of the Buddha were carved into the rock, surrounded by attendants and decorative elements. Their scale is striking when compared with the small meditation chambers nearby. The complex could contain both intimate spaces and enormous sacred images. One of the most interesting aspects of Kanheri is that everything had to be created with relatively simple tools. The builders stood directly against the rock face, removed layer after layer, and slowly transformed the mountain. There was no opportunity to move a finished wall into position. If they made a serious mistake, the mountain could not simply be replaced. The caves also show how carefully ancient architects understood the natural landscape. Paths connect different levels. Steps climb through the hillside. Water channels follow the contours of the rock, and rooms are positioned around the terrain. The monastery was designed together with the mountain. Eventually, Kanheri's importance began to decline. Buddhist institutions across Western India changed. Political conditions shifted, and the networks that supported the monastery weakened. The caves were gradually abandoned. The forest returned. Plants grew across the paths. Water continued running through the old channels, and the quiet meditation rooms were left empty. But unlike wooden buildings, the caves themselves could not easily disappear. They remained carved into the hillside. Today, visitors can still walk through the ancient complex. The modern city of Mumbai is not far away. Yet inside the caves, the atmosphere changes completely. Stone corridors, dark chambers, carved pillars, and ancient inscriptions preserve the memory of a community that lived here centuries ago. The lost palace of Xanadu. On the vast grasslands of northern China, the remains of a forgotten imperial city lie scattered beneath the open sky. Earth walls, stone foundations, collapsed buildings, and enormous rectangular platforms are all that remain of a palace complex that once stood at the center of the Mongol Empire. This was Shangdu, better known in the West as Xanadu, a city built for the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan and one of the most famous lost imperial capitals in history. Xanadu was established in the 13th century, when the Mongol Empire controlled an enormous territory stretching across Asia and into Europe. Kublai Khan eventually became emperor of the Yuan dynasty, and Shangdu became one of his most important imperial residences. It was not simply a palace. It was an entire planned city. The location was carefully chosen. Shangdu stood on the grasslands of Inner Mongolia, where the landscape provided excellent pasture for horses and livestock. The climate was also cooler than the capital farther south, making the city an attractive seasonal residence for the Mongol court. Kublai Khan could move between his major centers of power, following the seasons. The city was divided into several areas. There was an outer city, an inner city, and a palace district. Massive walls surrounded these sections, creating a carefully organized imperial landscape. Inside, palaces, administrative buildings, religious structures, gardens, and residential areas once filled the city. The foundations visible today are only fragments. Many buildings were constructed from materials that could not survive centuries of exposure. Wooden roofs collapsed, walls deteriorated, and valuable architectural materials were removed or reused. What remains are the parts that were hardest to erase: earthworks, stone foundations, and traces of the original city plan. The palace district was the heart of Xanadu. This was where the imperial court lived, officials worked, and important ceremonies took place. The buildings would have been richly decorated, with painted surfaces, carved wood, textiles, and objects brought from across the Mongol Empire. The city also reflected the multicultural nature of Kublai Khan's empire. The Mongol court ruled over Chinese, Central Asian, Persian, Tibetan, and many other communities. People from different regions traveled to the imperial capital, bringing languages, religions, skills, and artistic traditions with them. This mixture was visible in the architecture. Chinese building traditions were combined with Mongol imperial customs, while influences from other parts of Asia appeared throughout the court. Xanadu was therefore not simply a Mongolian city. It was a meeting point between different worlds. The palace foundations give us an idea of the scale. Large platforms were created to support monumental buildings, while broad courtyards separated different sections of the complex. The arrangement was carefully planned, rather than developing randomly over time. Imagine arriving at Xanadu during Kublai Khan's reign. The grasslands would stretch toward the horizon, while enormous walls marked the approach to the imperial city. Inside, horses and carts would move through the streets. Officials would travel between administrative buildings, and members of the imperial court would occupy the palace district. The city was also surrounded by gardens and water features. The Mongol rulers were fascinated by landscapes, and the palace complex incorporated elements of Chinese garden design. Artificial lakes, pavilions, and carefully arranged spaces created a controlled environment within the wider grasslands. Xanadu became so famous that travelers carried stories of it across the world. One of the most famous visitors associated with the city was Marco Polo. His account described the splendor of Kublai Khan's summer capital, helping create the legendary image of Xanadu in European imagination. Centuries later, the name Xanadu became almost synonymous with luxury and mystery. But the actual archaeological site is very different from the romantic image. There are no towering palaces today, no golden roofs, and no imperial court. Only the foundations remain. The city eventually lost its importance. After the fall of the Yuan dynasty in the 14th century, the Mongol rulers lost control of China. Chengdu was abandoned, and its buildings were gradually destroyed. The grasslands slowly reclaimed the ruins. Walls collapsed, roofs disappeared, and the palace complex became little more than raised earth and scattered stones. The city that had once represented imperial power became almost invisible. For centuries, Xanadu existed largely as a name in historical texts. The physical remains were still there, but the imperial city itself had disappeared. Modern archaeology began mapping the ruins, revealing just how extensive the settlement had been. The foundations are particularly important because they preserve the layout of the lost city. Even when the buildings themselves are gone, the positions of their foundations reveal where halls once stood, where courtyards were located, and how different sections of the palace were connected. Archaeologists can therefore reconstruct parts of Xanadu without rebuilding the buildings themselves. The ground becomes a kind of architectural map. Every platform, every wall, and every surviving stone can provide information about the city. Today, the ruins of Xanadu look peaceful. Grass covers much of the ancient palace district, and the surrounding landscape appears almost empty. But beneath that quiet surface, the foundations preserve the remains of an imperial capital. The stone wheel of the Levant, Rujam El Hiri, stands on the Golan Heights, near the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. The monument was built from thousands of basalt stones, a material that was readily available in the volcanic landscape. Instead of creating a single massive structure, its builders arranged the stones into a series of enormous concentric circles. The outermost ring is roughly 150 meters across. Inside it, additional circular walls create a layered pattern. At the center, there is a raised stone mound. The entire arrangement covers a huge area, yet the stones themselves are relatively low. The monument was designed to be experienced across the landscape, rather than simply from inside a building. Archaeologists generally date the construction to the early Bronze Age, although the exact chronology and phases of use remain debated. The monument was probably built around the 3rd millennium BC, making it more than 4,000 years old. That means it was already ancient when many later civilizations of the region were developing. The sheer amount of labor involved is difficult to ignore. Thousands of basalt blocks had to be collected, transported, and arranged into precise circular walls. The builders had no modern machinery, no aerial view to guide them, and no written instructions explaining their design. Yet the overall pattern is remarkably organized. At the center, a large burial chamber or central monument occupies the heart of the structure. This has led many researchers to connect Rujum el Hira with funerary activity. But the exact purpose of the monument remains uncertain. Was it primarily a tomb? A ceremonial gathering place? A monument connected with astronomy? Or something that served several purposes over its long history? That uncertainty has made Rujum el Hira especially fascinating. For many years, researchers suggested that the monument may have been connected with observing the movements of the sun and stars. Certain openings and alignments appear to correspond with astronomical events, but the extent to which astronomy determined the original design remains debated. The problem is that the monument was not necessarily built in a single stage. Different sections may have been constructed or modified over time. If that happened, some of the alignments visible today may not represent the intentions of the earliest builders. The monument may have changed as generations returned to it. This is one of the challenges of studying prehistoric structures. There are no written records, no builder's plans, and no ancient explanation. Archaeologists have to reconstruct the purpose from the physical evidence, the stones, the burials, the surrounding landscape, and the way the structure was built. Imagine standing here thousands of years ago. The Golan landscape would have been open, with grasslands extending across the plateau. The stone circles would have been clearly visible from a distance. People approaching the monument would first encounter the enormous outer wall, then gradually move toward the center. The central chamber may have held a burial. If so, the monument would have connected the living with the dead. The circular walls could have created a boundary between ordinary space and a place considered special or sacred. But the monument's unusual shape raises another possibility. The circles may have represented something larger than a burial site. Circular architecture appears in many prehistoric cultures, and circles can mark boundaries, gathering spaces, or ceremonial areas. Rujum el Hira may have served several functions over different periods. The surrounding region was also changing. During the early Bronze Age, communities across the Levant were developing more complex settlements, trade networks, and new forms of social organization. Monuments such as Rujum el Hira required cooperation. Someone had to organize the workers, collect the stone, plan the layout, and maintain the structure. That means the monument tells us something about the society that created it. Even without knowing their names, we can see that they were capable of coordinating large-scale construction. The monument represents collective effort, not the work of a single individual. The basalt stones themselves also provide clues. They were gathered from the surrounding landscape, rather than carved into elaborate blocks. The builders used what was available, turning rough volcanic stones into a carefully organized design. Over time, the monument lost its original meaning. The people who built it disappeared. New communities settled across the region, and the purpose of the stone circles was forgotten. The structure remained, but the explanation did not. For centuries, Rujum el Hira stood exposed to the elements. Grass grew between the stones. Wind and rain slowly changed the landscape, but the circular walls remained visible. The monument survived because its builders had created something extremely simple and extremely durable: stone arranged on stone. Modern archaeology eventually began studying the site in detail. Researchers mapped the circles, examined the central structure, and investigated the surrounding landscape. Aerial photography made the overall design much easier to understand. From above, the enormous wheel-like pattern becomes unmistakable. The name Rujum el Hira is Arabic, and the monument is also known by the Hebrew name Gilgal Rephaim. The name connects the site with the biblical tradition of the Rephaim, although that association belongs to later tradition rather than providing evidence for who actually built the monument. This distinction is important. The monument is prehistoric. Its builders lived thousands of years before the biblical traditions that later became associated with the landscape. The name tells us about later interpretations, not necessarily about the people who originally constructed the circles. The underground necropolis of Al-Saflieni. Beneath an ordinary-looking part of Malta, a doorway leads into a world carved completely beneath the ground. There are chambers, passageways, burial rooms, and enormous spaces shaped directly from the limestone. More than 5,000 years ago, people entered this underground complex to bury their dead and perform rituals. This is the Cal-Saflieni Hypogeum, one of the most extraordinary prehistoric underground monuments in the Mediterranean. The hypogeum lies in Paola, not far from modern Valletta. Unlike a typical ancient temple standing above the landscape, almost the entire monument is underground. Its builders carved downward through Malta's soft limestone, creating several levels beneath the surface. The result is an enormous artificial cavern, built entirely by human hands. The earliest parts of the complex date to the Neolithic period, more than 5,000 years ago. At that time, Malta was home to farming communities who constructed some of the earliest monumental architecture in Europe. The hypogeum belonged to that same remarkable prehistoric tradition. The monument was not created all at once. It developed over generations, with new chambers and passages carved into the rock. As the complex expanded, earlier spaces were modified, connected, and incorporated into a much larger underground system. Archaeologists believe the hypogeum was primarily a funerary and ritual complex. The dead were placed inside its chambers, while ceremonies were probably performed by the living. Thousands of human remains were eventually deposited here. The scale of the burial activity is remarkable. The hypogeum was not the tomb of one ruler or one wealthy family. It appears to have served a wider community. Generation after generation, people returned to the underground chambers. Imagine entering the hypogeum when it was still in use. You would descend beneath the surface, leaving the daylight behind. The narrow passages would lead deeper into the limestone, until the spaces opened into larger chambers. Torchlight would have flickered across the carved walls. The builders created rooms that imitate architectural forms found in Malta's above-ground temples. There are doorways, false windows, columns, and curved architectural details, but none of them were constructed from separate blocks. Everything was carved directly into the living rock. One of the most famous spaces is the oracle room. Its walls contain a small opening, and sounds made inside the chamber can produce an unusual resonance. The acoustic properties of the room have attracted considerable attention. Voices can carry through the stone, creating an effect that would have been striking in a ritual environment. Nearby is the main chamber, a large circular space with carefully shaped walls. The ceiling was carved to resemble the interior of a monumental building. The builders were essentially creating an underground version of the architecture they already knew above ground. Another remarkable space is known as the Holy of Holies. The name was given much later, but the chamber contains some of the most impressive surviving architectural details. A large doorway, curved walls, and carefully carved surfaces create the appearance of a monumental sacred building. The decoration is surprisingly sophisticated. Some surfaces were painted in red ochre, creating color against the pale limestone. Spirals, geometric patterns, and other designs appear in parts of the complex. The underground environment, therefore, would not have been completely dark and colorless. The famous sleeping lady was also discovered here. The small terracotta figure depicts a reclining human form and is one of Malta's best-known prehistoric artifacts. Its exact meaning is uncertain. It may have represented a sleeping person, a deity, or a symbolic figure connected with death and rebirth. Other objects recovered from the hypogeum include pottery, stone tools, personal ornaments, and carved objects. Together, they provide clues about the people who used the underground complex. But the hypogeum's greatest mystery is not necessarily what happened inside. It is how the builders created it. They had no metal machinery, no modern drills, and no electric lighting. Yet they carved enormous chambers deep beneath the surface. The tools available to them were relatively simple, including stone implements. The limestone was workable, but carving such a huge underground complex still required enormous amounts of labor. Workers had to remove thousands of tons of stone while carefully supporting the remaining structure. The builders also had to understand the stability of the rock. A mistake underground could have caused a collapse. Instead, many chambers survived for thousands of years. The prehistoric builders had developed impressive practical knowledge. The hypogeum was eventually abandoned. The reasons are not completely understood. Malta's prehistoric temple culture changed. Populations declined or moved, and the underground complex gradually ceased to function. The chambers were left behind. For thousands of years, the hypogeum remained hidden beneath the surface. Then, in the early 20th century, its existence came to the attention of modern researchers after the site was discovered during construction work. Archaeologists began excavating the underground rooms, revealing a monument that had been almost completely forgotten. The discovery transformed our understanding of prehistoric Malta. The island was clearly home to communities capable of organizing enormous construction projects, creating complex architecture, and maintaining elaborate funerary traditions. The hypogeum became another piece of that remarkable prehistoric landscape. But excavation also created a new problem. The underground environment had been remarkably stable for thousands of years. Once large numbers of visitors entered, humidity, carbon dioxide, and changes in temperature began affecting the fragile surfaces. Conservation, therefore, became essential. The hypogeum has undergone major preservation work, including environmental controls designed to protect the ancient limestone and paintings. Access is also carefully managed. The monument cannot simply be opened to unlimited visitors. The walled town the mountains kept. Sapanum lies near the modern village of Altilia, surrounded by the mountains of the Apennines. The location may seem remote today, but in antiquity, this was an important point along a route connecting the interior of the region with the wider Roman world. The mountains did not isolate Sapanum completely. They helped protect it. The town developed from an earlier Samnite settlement, before Roman control transformed the area. The Samnites were one of the major peoples of ancient central and southern Italy, and they occupied the mountainous regions around Molise long before Rome expanded into the area. Sapanum therefore has a history older than its Roman streets. After the Roman conquest, the settlement was reorganized. The Romans built defensive walls, formal streets, public buildings, and monumental entrances. The result was a town that combined the older landscape with Roman urban planning. One of the most impressive features is the city wall. Large sections remain remarkably well preserved, following the natural contours of the settlement. Several gates provided access through the walls, connecting Sapanum with the roads outside. The gates were not simply practical openings, they were monumental entrances. Passing through one meant entering a controlled urban space, where the streets were organized, the buildings were concentrated, and public life followed a Roman pattern. The main streets crossed through the town, creating a recognizable Roman urban layout. Along them, shops, workshops, homes, and public buildings once stood. People would have walked these same routes nearly 2,000 years ago. One of the most important buildings is the Forum. This was the political and social center of the Roman town. Public business could be conducted here. Officials could meet, and citizens could gather. The surrounding buildings reinforced the importance of the space. Near the Forum, the remains of a basilica survive. In Roman towns, a basilica could serve as a place for legal proceedings, business, and public administration. Its presence demonstrates that Sapanum was more than a small rural settlement. It possessed the institutions of an organized Roman town. The town also had a theater. Its surviving remains show that entertainment formed part of urban life. Performances could bring together people from Sapanum and the surrounding countryside. The theater also demonstrates the resources invested in the town. Even a relatively remote community could possess monumental public architecture. But Sapanum was not built only for officials and wealthy citizens. The remains of shops and workshops reveal ordinary economic activity. Merchants sold goods, craftsmen worked, animals moved through the streets, and farmers brought products into the settlement. The town was connected to the agricultural landscape around it. That connection is especially important. Sapanum stood near an ancient route used for the movement of livestock. The area became associated with transhumance, the seasonal movement of animals between different grazing grounds. The Roman town therefore benefited from the movement of people and animals through the surrounding mountains. Imagine Sapanum during its busiest period. Shepherds would arrive with livestock. Merchants would enter through the city gates. Officials would move toward the Forum, and residents would travel along the stone-paved streets. The mountains would surround the town on every side. The landscape itself helped shape the town. The Romans did not build Sapanum on a completely open plain. They adapted the settlement to the existing terrain. The walls follow the contours, and the mountains rise behind them. This gives the town its distinctive character. Eventually, Roman power in the region began to decline. The political system that had supported Sapunum changed, trade patterns shifted, and the town gradually lost its importance. But unlike many ancient cities, Sapunum was not completely transformed by later urban development. That is one of the reasons it survives so well. Later generations did not build a modern city directly over the Roman streets. The ancient town remained relatively undisturbed. Grass spread across the ruins, trees grew around the walls, and the mountains continued to surround the abandoned settlement. The result is an unusual archaeological landscape. You can still walk through the ancient gates, follow the streets, stand inside the forum, and see the outlines of buildings that once formed a functioning Roman community. The town feels less like a collection of isolated ruins, and more like a place that was simply left behind. Archaeologists have been able to reconstruct much of Sapunum's layout because so much of the original urban plan remains visible. The walls, roads, gates, forum, theater, and houses all help reveal how the town was organized. But the most fascinating stories may come from the ordinary details. A doorway tells us where someone entered a building. A shop tells us where goods were sold. A worn section of pavement hints at thousands of footsteps. A drainage channel shows how people managed water. These small features bring the ancient town closer to everyday life. The surrounding mountains also help explain why Sapunum feels so different from famous Roman cities such as Rome or Pompeii. There are no enormous crowds here, no modern buildings surrounding the ruins, and no dense urban landscape. Instead, the ancient town sits quietly within the countryside. That isolation helped preserve something unusual: the relationship between the Roman settlement and its environment. The walls remain, but beyond them, the same mountains still dominate the horizon. Sapunum eventually became a place of ruins, but the landscape around it never completely changed. The ancient roads once carried merchants and shepherds. Today, they lead visitors through fields and grass. The forum once hosted public life. Now it is surrounded by silence. Histria, the ancient city beside the Black Sea. On the western shore of the Black Sea, the remains of an ancient Greek city lie beside a landscape that has changed dramatically over time. Stone streets, temples, market buildings, fortifications, and the remains of houses reveal a settlement that survived for more than 1,000 years. This is Histria, one of the oldest Greek colonies on the western Black Sea coast. Histria was founded by Greek settlers from Miletus around the 7th century BC, long before the Roman Empire reached this region. The settlers chose the area near the ancient coast of the Black Sea, close to the enormous Danube Delta. The location gave the city access to both maritime trade and the resources of the surrounding region. At first, Histria was a Greek trading settlement. Ships could arrive from the Aegean, while local products moved in the opposite direction. Grain, fish, salt, animal products, and other goods could be exchanged through the city's markets. Histria became part of a much larger Black Sea trading network. The city also produced its own coins. From an early period, Histria minted distinctive silver and bronze currency. Some of its coins carried the city's famous eagle and dolphin imagery, a reminder of its connection with both the land and the sea. These coins eventually traveled beyond the city itself. But Histria was never completely isolated from the communities already living around the Black Sea. Greek settlers interacted with local populations, including Thracian groups in the surrounding region. Trade created connections, but it also created competition. The city existed within a landscape where different cultures met. Over time, Histria grew. The settlement expanded beyond its earliest center, and monumental buildings appeared. Temples, public spaces, residential quarters, and defensive walls transformed the small colony into a substantial urban center. One of the most important areas was the sacred zone. Several temples were constructed here, dedicated to different gods. Among them was the temple associated with Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love. Other religious buildings were dedicated to deities such as Zeus Peleus. The remains are fragmented today, but they reveal how strongly religion shaped the ancient city. Temples were not isolated buildings. They formed part of the public landscape, where ceremonies, offerings, and festivals could bring the community together. Histria also developed an agora, the central marketplace and civic space of a Greek city. Merchants could conduct business, citizens could gather, and public activities could take place. The agora connected the economic and political life of the settlement. But the city was not always peaceful. Histria faced attacks and political pressure from surrounding powers. The Black Sea region was constantly changing, as different kingdoms and peoples competed for influence. The city had to adapt. By the Hellenistic period, Histria had become part of a wider political world shaped by the successors of Alexander the Great. Later, Roman influence increased. Eventually, the city became part of the Roman Empire. Roman rule changed Histria. New buildings appeared. Roman architectural traditions were introduced, and the city became part of the empire's provincial network. But the older Greek identity did not simply disappear. Greek traditions continued within the city. This mixture is visible in the archaeology. Greek temples, Hellenistic structures, Roman buildings, and later Christian remains all occupy the same archaeological landscape. Histria became a city built from many different periods. One of the most interesting discoveries is the Roman bath complex. The baths contained heating systems, water channels, and rooms designed for different temperatures. This was a major investment for the city. The baths were not simply places to wash. They were social spaces. Imagine entering Histria during the Roman period. The harbor would have been busy. Merchants would have moved through the streets. People would gather in the marketplace. And smoke from workshops would rise above the houses. The ancient city would have sounded very different from the quiet ruins we see today. But something was changing around Histria. The coastline itself was gradually transforming. The ancient city once stood much closer to the open sea, but sediment carried by the Danube slowly changed the surrounding landscape. Lagoons and marshes expanded, and the coastline moved. This environmental change had serious consequences. A city whose prosperity depended heavily on maritime trade could not easily survive if its harbor became increasingly difficult to use. Histria's connection with the sea gradually weakened. At the same time, political and economic conditions were changing across the Roman world. Trade networks shifted, raids became more frequent, and the city became increasingly vulnerable. Defensive walls were strengthened, but eventually, Histria declined. By late antiquity, the settlement was much smaller than it had been during its earlier centuries. Parts of the city were abandoned, buildings fell into ruin, and some areas were reused for new purposes. Eventually, Histria was abandoned completely. The landscape continued changing. Water and sediment covered parts of the ancient environment, while vegetation gradually spread across the ruins. The city disappeared from everyday life, but its remains stayed beneath the soil. Modern archaeology began uncovering Histria in the early 20th century. Excavations revealed temples, streets, houses, fortifications, coins, pottery, and inscriptions. Piece by piece, the ancient city began to return. The stone circle buried beneath the German fields. In the countryside of Saxony-Anhalt, a strange circular pattern lies hidden beneath the landscape. From the ground, there is little to suggest what once stood here. But beneath the soil, archaeologists uncovered an enormous prehistoric enclosure made from timber posts, earthworks, and carefully arranged structures. This is Pumulti, a remarkable prehistoric ceremonial site often described as Germany's answer to Stonehenge. Pumulti lies near the Elbe River in central Germany, not far from the modern town of Schönebeck. The monument was built during the 3rd millennium BC, at a time when communities across Central Europe were constructing increasingly elaborate ceremonial sites. Unlike Stonehenge, Pumulti was built primarily from wood, and that made it much harder to recognize after thousands of years. The monument consisted of several concentric rings. Large wooden posts were positioned around a central area, creating a huge circular enclosure. Ditches, banks, palisades, and timber structures formed different zones within the monument. From above, the overall design becomes remarkably clear. The site was not simply one circle. It was a carefully organized ceremonial complex. Archaeologists identified several entrances, with some aligned along particular directions. The arrangement created controlled routes into the central area, suggesting that movement through the monument may have been part of its purpose. The people who built Pumulti left no written explanation. We do not know exactly what ceremonies took place here, or what the circles meant to the communities who constructed them. But archaeology provides some unusual clues. Human remains, animal bones, pottery, and deliberately broken objects were discovered in pits around the monument. Some of these deposits appear to have been intentional. Objects were placed into the ground, then covered, almost as if the act of burying them was itself part of a ceremony. This has led researchers to suggest that Pumulte was connected with ritual activity. The human remains are particularly important. Some individuals were buried in unusual ways, and archaeologists have investigated whether certain deaths may have been violent. The evidence is complex, and it does not necessarily mean that the entire site was a place of sacrifice, but it does show that death was somehow connected with the monument. The site, therefore, appears to have been more than a simple gathering place. It may have been used for ceremonies involving the dead, seasonal events, offerings, and possibly astronomical observations. Different activities may have taken place there over generations. The monument's circular design is also fascinating. The rings created different spaces within the complex, with the central area separated from the outer zones. People approaching the monument would have passed through carefully positioned entrances, moving from one part of the sacred landscape to another. Imagine Pumulte when it was new. The timber posts would have risen above the surrounding landscape, freshly cut wood standing in precise circular rows. People would have gathered inside the enclosure. Fires may have burned. Pottery vessels would have been used, and ceremonies would have taken place beneath the open sky. The monument was built during a period of major change in prehistoric Europe. Communities were becoming increasingly connected. Metalworking was spreading. Long-distance exchange networks were developing, and people were creating larger ceremonial landscapes. Pumulte belonged to this changing world. The nearby Elbe River would have been important. Rivers provided water, transport routes, and access to different ecological zones. People living in the region could exchange goods and ideas across considerable distances. Pumulte was not necessarily an isolated monument. Other prehistoric sites existed across Central Europe, and similar circular enclosures have been discovered in Germany and neighboring regions. These sites show that circular ceremonial architecture was part of a much wider prehistoric tradition. But Pumulte was eventually abandoned. The timber posts decayed, the structures collapsed, and the circular monument gradually disappeared from the landscape. Unlike a stone monument, wood left little visible evidence above ground. For centuries, the site was effectively invisible. Agriculture transformed the landscape. Fields were cultivated, soil was moved, and the memory of the ancient enclosure disappeared. Nothing obvious remained to tell people that a huge ceremonial complex had once stood there. Then aerial archaeology began revealing unusual patterns. Differences in vegetation and soil showed traces of circular structures beneath the fields. Archaeologists investigated, and the outline of the prehistoric monument began to emerge. Excavation revealed post holes, ditches, pits, and the remains of the enormous circular design. The invisible monument had returned, not as standing timber, but as archaeological traces preserved beneath the ground. Researchers were able to reconstruct the layout using thousands of individual features. Each post hole represented a place where a wooden post had once stood. Together, they formed the outline of the ancient structure. It was a remarkable example of how archaeology can reconstruct a monument that physically disappeared thousands of years ago. The ancient sanctuary of Rocapertis. In the hills of southern France, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a sanctuary unlike almost anything else in the ancient Celtic world. Stone sculptures, carved heads, warriors, and mysterious seated figures were found among the ruins. Some had been deliberately broken. Others had been placed inside the sanctuary in ways that remained difficult to understand. This was Rocapertis, an ancient Celtic religious site in what is now the Bouches-du-Rhône region of France. Rocapertis lies near the modern village of Vilo, not far from Marseille. The sanctuary belonged to the ancient peoples of southern Gaul, a region inhabited by communities that the Romans would later describe collectively as Gauls. But long before Roman control, local communities had already developed their own religious traditions. Rocapertis gives us a rare glimpse into that world. The sanctuary is generally associated with the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC. Although activity in the surrounding area may have begun earlier, the site appears to have been connected with a fortified settlement, and its position suggests that it was part of a larger community landscape. This was not simply an isolated collection of sculptures. The most famous discoveries are the sculptures. Among them are 2 remarkable seated figures, shown with their legs crossed. Their bodies were carved in stone, and their faces have a distinctive, almost expressionless appearance. The exact identity of these figures remains uncertain. One interpretation connects them with Celtic religious figures, perhaps deities or important ancestors. Another possibility is that they represented warriors or elite individuals. Without inscriptions, there is no definitive answer. The sculptures can show us how people were represented, but not exactly what they meant. One of the most striking features is the presence of birds. A stone sculpture depicting a bird with outstretched wings became one of the site's most recognizable objects. Birds may have had religious significance, possibly representing connections between the human world and the supernatural. But again, the precise symbolism remains uncertain. The sanctuary also contained carved human heads. Some heads appear remarkably naturalistic, while others are more stylized. Their significance has been debated for generations. Were they representations of ancestors? Enemies? Warriors? Or supernatural beings? The archaeological evidence cannot provide a single answer. The human head appears repeatedly in Iron Age Celtic art, but its meaning was not necessarily the same everywhere. At Rhocopertus, the heads may have been connected with religious beliefs, but their exact role within the sanctuary remains one of the site's mysteries. Another unusual discovery involved niches or architectural features associated with the sculptures. The sanctuary appears to have been designed to display important images, rather than simply storing them. The arrangement created a religious space where particular objects and figures held special significance. Imagine approaching Rhocopertus more than 2,000 years ago. The sanctuary would have looked very different from the archaeological ruins today. Painted surfaces may have added color. Wooden elements could have surrounded the stone structures, and people would have gathered here for ceremonies. Offerings may have been placed before the sacred images. The surrounding settlement would also have been active. People farmed, crafted tools, traded goods, and defended their communities. Religion was not separated completely from daily life. The sanctuary existed within the same world as the settlement. The site may also have had a connection with warfare. Southern Gaul during this period was divided among numerous communities, and competition between groups could be intense. The presence of warrior imagery at Rhocopertus has therefore attracted considerable attention, but it is difficult to determine whether the sanctuary was specifically dedicated to warriors. The most disturbing part of the site's history is what happened to some of the sculptures. Several were found broken or damaged. This could have happened during an episode of destruction, perhaps when the sanctuary was attacked or abandoned. But deliberate destruction may also have been part of changing religious practices. The Romans eventually expanded into southern Gaul. Roman armies and political influence transformed the region, and local communities were gradually incorporated into the Roman world. Rhocopertus's earlier religious tradition disappeared. The sanctuary was abandoned, and its sculptures were left behind. For centuries, the ruins were hidden beneath the landscape. The site remained largely unknown to the modern world, until archaeological investigations began revealing its remains. The discoveries were extraordinary. Stone figures, heads, architectural fragments, and other objects emerged from the ground. The sculptures attracted enormous attention because they challenged older ideas about Celtic art. The ancient Celts were often portrayed as having little monumental artistic tradition. Rhocopertus demonstrated otherwise. These communities could create sophisticated religious sculpture, architectural decoration, and carefully organized sanctuaries. The discovery also revealed how diverse ancient Europe really was. The Mediterranean world is often associated with monumental sculpture, but Celtic communities north of the Mediterranean developed their own artistic traditions. Rhocopertus belongs to that separate cultural tradition, even while existing relatively close to Greek and Roman settlements. The village built on artificial islands. The story of Longola began unexpectedly. In 2000, workers were excavating for a water treatment facility near the Sarno River. Then, archaeological material began appearing in the soil. Pottery, wood, animal remains, and other objects were coming out of the ground. The construction work was stopped, and archaeologists began investigating. What they discovered was extraordinary. Longola had been occupied from the Middle Bronze Age until the 6th century BC. That means generations of people lived here, rebuilt their homes, changed the settlement, and repeatedly modified the landscape. It was not a temporary camp. It was a community that endured for centuries. The settlement was built in a wet environment. Instead of simply abandoning the marshy ground, the inhabitants transformed it. They constructed artificial islands, using wooden posts, beams, and layers of material to raise and stabilize the ground. Around these islands, they created canals. The canals were not simply drainage ditches. They provided routes through the settlement. People could move between different parts of the village by water, and boats could travel through the narrow channels. The village had effectively been engineered around water. The houses stood on the raised areas. They were constructed from perishable materials, so almost none of the original buildings survive above ground. But the archaeological remains reveal different house layouts, including rectangular and apsidal forms. Some contained hearths, while others had spaces that may have been used for production. The most remarkable part is how much of the wooden construction survived. Normally, wood disappears from archaeological sites after thousands of years. But Longola was different. The waterlogged environment created conditions with very little oxygen, slowing the decay of organic materials. As a result, wooden posts, tools, structures, and boats were preserved. Among the discoveries were 3 dugout canoes. They were long, narrow, and designed for movement along the waterways. One was recovered almost completely, while 2 others were found still associated with mooring posts. Their survival gives us an extraordinary glimpse into how people actually moved through the settlement. Imagine Longola when the village was alive. The landscape would have been very different from the modern countryside. Woodlands surrounded the wetlands. Water filled the channels, and small boats moved between the artificial islands. People could step from their houses directly toward the canals, then travel through the settlement by water. The river was also a major advantage. The Sarno was navigable in antiquity, connecting the interior with the coast. Goods could move downstream, eventually reaching wider Mediterranean trading networks. Longola therefore occupied an unusually strategic position. Archaeologists have found evidence that the inhabitants were skilled craftsmen. Metalworking, boneworking, glass paste production, and amber working all took place at the settlement. There were not only farmers living here. Specialized production was an important part of the community's economy. Amber is particularly interesting. Objects made from amber indicate that Longola was connected to exchange networks extending far beyond southern Italy. Other finds include ceramics, bronze objects, iron, glass paste, and worked bone. These materials show that the village was participating in a much wider world. The settlement also appears to have had connections with the nearby coast. Goods could travel along the Sarno, then reach the Tyrrhenian Sea. From there, they could enter networks connecting Italian communities with Greek traders and other Mediterranean societies. Longola was therefore not an isolated prehistoric village. The inhabitants also had an impressive understanding of water management. The artificial islands were repeatedly strengthened and modified. Wooden structures were used to stabilize their edges, while additional material was added to raise and expand the settlement. Over generations, the village was essentially rebuilt from the ground upward. This makes Longola one of the most fascinating examples of prehistoric engineering in southern Italy. The inhabitants did not simply adapt to the wetlands. They reshaped them. They created dry ground where there had been marsh, then connected that ground with navigable waterways. The site also provides clues about the environment itself. Wood remains from different species, along with animal and plant remains, allow archaeologists to reconstruct parts of the ancient landscape. Oak woodland was especially important, providing timber for construction and other activities. But eventually, the village was abandoned. By the beginning of the 6th century BC, Longola was no longer functioning as the settlement it had once been. Exactly why this happened remains uncertain. Environmental changes, flooding, and changing settlement patterns have all been considered. The timing is particularly interesting. During this period, new centers were developing in the surrounding region. The later cities of Pompeii and Nuceria were becoming increasingly important. Some researchers have considered whether population movements from Longola and the wider Sarno Valley contributed to the development of these centers. But that connection remains a matter of interpretation rather than established fact. Whatever the reason, Longola eventually fell silent. The canals filled, the wooden houses collapsed, and layers of wet soil covered the settlement. The village disappeared beneath the landscape, and that burial became its greatest protection. The same water that had surrounded the settlement helped preserve it. For more than 2,000 years, the remains stayed hidden beneath the ground. When archaeologists finally uncovered the site, they were able to see details that normally disappear from prehistoric settlements. Wooden construction, ancient tools, canals, and boats all survived together. It was almost like opening a time capsule. The giant stone tomb standing alone in Cornwall. Trethevy stands near the village of St. Clear, on the edge of Bodmin Moor in southwestern England. The surrounding landscape is rugged, open, and scattered with ancient monuments. But Trethevy immediately stands out. Its huge capstone appears to balance above the chamber, creating the impression of an enormous stone table. The monument dates to the Neolithic period, probably around the 4th millennium BC. That makes it roughly 5,000 years old, possibly even older depending on the dating of the surrounding monument tradition. The people who built it lived thousands of years before Stonehenge took its final form. Trethevy is a type of monument known as a dolmen, a megalithic chamber constructed from large stones. The basic design is simple. Several upright slabs support a much larger capstone, creating an enclosed chamber beneath. But moving those stones would have been anything but simple. The enormous capstone is estimated to weigh several tons. The builders had no cranes, no metal machinery, and no modern roads. They had to move the stone using human labor, wooden equipment, ropes, and carefully planned construction methods. The exact techniques remain uncertain. Perhaps wooden rollers helped move the stones, or sledges were dragged across prepared ground. Earth ramps could have been constructed, allowing workers to raise the capstone gradually. Whatever method was used, the project required cooperation. The chamber beneath the capstone was probably connected with burial. These monuments are generally interpreted as Neolithic communal tombs, places where human remains could be deposited over generations. Trethevy therefore may have been used by a community, rather than a single individual. But the original burial contents have largely disappeared. The monument was disturbed over centuries, and later visitors entered the chamber. Without the complete archaeological context, it is difficult to reconstruct exactly how the tomb was originally used. The structure itself gives us important clues. The upright stones create a narrow chamber, while the massive capstone provides a roof. At one end, a large slab forms part of the entrance. The builders carefully positioned each stone, creating an architectural space from natural rock. There is also a smaller stone projecting from the top of the monument. Its exact purpose is uncertain, but it may have once been part of a more complex arrangement. The monument we see today may not be completely identical to its original form. Imagine approaching Trethevy 5,000 years ago. The surrounding landscape would have looked different. There would have been fewer trees, more open grassland, and small farming communities spread across the region. The monument would have stood prominently within that landscape. People could have gathered here for ceremonies, burial rituals, or commemorations of the dead. The tomb may have represented a connection between the living community, their ancestors, and the landscape they depended upon. Trethevy was not an isolated phenomenon. Across Cornwall and the wider British Isles, Neolithic communities constructed hundreds of megalithic monuments. Some were tombs, others were ceremonial structures, and many were part of much larger prehistoric landscapes. Cornwall contains several important examples: nearby monuments, standing stones, stone circles, and ancient burial sites show that this region was already heavily used during prehistory. Trethevy belonged to that wider tradition. The surrounding landscape is particularly important. Bodmin Moor contains numerous prehistoric monuments, including stone circles, settlements, and burial sites. Together, they reveal a landscape that was carefully used and repeatedly revisited by prehistoric communities. These people were not simply wandering across the countryside. They were farming, managing animals, building settlements, and creating permanent monuments. The effort required to construct Trethevy suggests that the monument held considerable importance. Over thousands of years, the meaning of the monument changed. The people who built it disappeared, their language was forgotten, and their burial traditions vanished. But the stones remained. Later generations would have encountered the monument without knowing exactly why it had been built. Stories and local traditions developed around prehistoric monuments across Britain, sometimes giving them supernatural associations. Trethevy became part of the folklore of the Cornish landscape. Its survival is remarkable. The capstone has remained supported by the upright slabs for thousands of years. Weather has worn the surfaces. Plants have grown around the stones, and the surrounding landscape has changed. Yet the basic structure still stands. Today, Trethevy is protected as an important prehistoric monument. Visitors can still approach the same stones, stand beneath the ancient capstone, and see the small chamber created by people who lived long before written history. The monument is especially powerful because of its simplicity. There are no elaborate carvings, no inscriptions, and no grand statues. Just a handful of enormous stones, placed together with extraordinary precision. Yet those stones represent an enormous investment of human effort. Someone had to find the right rock, transport it, raise the supporting slabs, and lift the massive capstone into position. Then, the community had to maintain the monument and remember its purpose. We may never know the names of the people buried here. We do not know what ceremonies took place, or exactly what the monument meant to the builders, but we can still see the physical result of their work. The stone tomb hidden on the Orkney Islands. Unstan Cairn stands on the shore of Stromness, Orkney, looking across the waters toward the surrounding islands. The landscape is open, windy, and almost completely exposed to the North Atlantic. But more than 5,000 years ago, Neolithic communities were building permanent monuments across this landscape. Unstan was one of them. The cairn dates to the Neolithic period and is generally placed around the 4th millennium BC. It belongs to a remarkable period in Orkney's history, when communities were constructing stone houses, burial chambers, and enormous ceremonial monuments. The tomb itself is built from large stone slabs. A long passage leads into the interior, eventually opening into the main chamber. From there, smaller side compartments branch away. The arrangement is surprisingly sophisticated. The builders created the chamber using large upright stones, then placed horizontal slabs across them. The result was a strong stone structure, capable of supporting the weight of the earth and stones placed above it. The entire monument was then covered, creating the mound visible from the surface. The interior would have been very different from the open landscape outside. The entrance passage would have been narrow and dark, leading gradually toward the central chamber. The transition from daylight into the enclosed tomb may have been an important part of the experience. The monument was not simply a place to bury one individual. Archaeological evidence indicates that multiple people were placed inside. The remains included adults and children, suggesting that the tomb may have served a community over an extended period. The dead were not necessarily placed inside immediately after death. Neolithic burial practices could involve several stages. Bodies may have been exposed or stored elsewhere, before selected bones were eventually placed inside the chamber. This means the tomb may have been part of a much longer ritual process. Among the objects discovered inside were pottery vessels. Some were examples of a distinctive style now known as Unstan ware. The pottery is particularly important because it helped archaeologists recognize a specific Neolithic tradition associated with Orkney. The vessels were often round-bottomed, and some were decorated with characteristic patterns. Their presence inside the tomb suggests that food or other offerings may have been associated with the burial rituals. But exactly how the pottery was used remains uncertain. Unstan Cairn is also interesting because it differs from another famous type of Orkney tomb, the Maeshowe-type chambered tombs. Those monuments often have larger central chambers, with carefully constructed passages and impressive corbelled roofs. Unstan represents a somewhat different architectural tradition, yet all these monuments belong to the same broader prehistoric world. Communities across Orkney were building permanent structures, returning to particular places, and creating monuments for the dead. The landscape itself became part of their traditions. Imagine Orkney more than 5,000 years ago. Small farming communities would have cultivated crops, raised animals, and traveled between settlements. The sea was not simply a barrier, it was a route. People could travel between islands by boat, carrying tools, food, pottery, and ideas. The surrounding landscape contains other extraordinary Neolithic monuments. The heart of Neolithic Orkney includes sites such as Skara Brae, Maeshowe, the Stones of Stennis, and the Ring of Brodgar. Together, they reveal an unusually rich prehistoric landscape. Unstan belongs to this same world, but its purpose was more intimate. Instead of a huge open ceremonial circle, the monument brought people underground, into a chamber containing the remains of their ancestors. The location beside the water may also have mattered. The tomb sits close to the shore, with views across the surrounding landscape. The people who built it were placing their dead within a carefully chosen environment, connected to both land and sea. Over time, the tomb was used repeatedly. Bones were moved, new burials were added, and objects were placed inside. Eventually, the chamber was closed, the entrance was blocked, and the monument became a mound in the landscape. For thousands of years, the tomb remained largely hidden. The stones stayed in place, the burial deposits remained inside, and the mound gradually became part of the surrounding landscape. When archaeologists eventually investigated the monument, they discovered that the chamber had preserved evidence of Neolithic burial practices. The pottery, human remains, and architecture together provided a rare glimpse into the lives and beliefs of Orkney's earliest farming communities. But the tomb still leaves important questions unanswered. Who exactly was buried here? Were the people related? Did the same community use the chamber for generations? And what ceremonies accompanied the movement of the dead? The stones cannot answer all of these questions, but they tell us something important. The builders cared enough about their dead to construct a permanent monument, something that required planning, labor, and cooperation. The tomb also demonstrates the technical ability of Neolithic builders. They selected suitable stones, transported them, positioned them vertically, and created a roof strong enough to survive beneath a huge mound. All of this was accomplished without modern machinery. The stone tower standing above the Orkney Sea, on a remote island in northern Scotland, a massive stone tower rises from the landscape. Its walls are thick, its entrance is narrow, and inside, a maze of chambers and passages is still visible. This is Midhow Broch, one of the best-known Iron Age broch sites on the island of Rousay. Midhow stands on the west coast of Rousay in the Orkney Islands. The broch overlooks the sea, with steep cliffs and open grasslands surrounding the site. From its position, the builders had a wide view across the waters. But Midhow was not simply built to look impressive. It was a carefully engineered stone structure, designed around a central tower. The monument belongs to the Iron Age, although the exact date of its construction remains uncertain. Brochs are a distinctive type of prehistoric stone architecture found mainly in northern Scotland. They are characterized by massive circular walls and complex internal spaces. Midhow is one of the clearest examples. The outer walls were built from enormous quantities of stone. The structure originally stood much higher than the ruins visible today, with a tall circular tower rising above the surrounding landscape. Its walls were extraordinarily thick, creating a strong and imposing building. But the most fascinating part is what lies inside the walls. The broch contains several internal galleries, small chambers, stairways, and passages built directly into the thickness of the stonework. Instead of simply making one solid wall, the builders created an entire network of spaces within it. A staircase once climbed upward through the structure. As people moved through the broch, they could access different levels of the building. The architecture, therefore, was not simply defensive, it was also highly organized. At the center, there was a large open space. Buildings and structures could have occupied this area, while people carried out everyday activities inside the protected enclosure. The broch may have been a residence, a place of refuge, a center of community activity, or several of these things at different times. That uncertainty is important. Archaeologists still debate exactly what brochs were built for. The enormous walls certainly provided protection, but the buildings were also too complex to be explained simply as military forts. Some may have been residences for important families or local leaders. Others could have served wider communities. Imagine Midhow when it was still complete. A tall stone tower would have dominated the coastline, visible from across the surrounding landscape. Inside, people would have moved through the central courtyard, worked, stored food, and maintained the building. Smoke from hearths may have risen toward the roof. The location would have been useful for more than defense. The surrounding waters provided access to marine resources, while the land supported farming and livestock. The community could exploit both environments. The sea was not simply a boundary. It was part of the settlement's world. Rousay itself contains many prehistoric monuments. The island is covered with evidence of thousands of years of human activity. from Neolithic chambered tombs to Bronze Age remains and Iron Age structures. Midhow belongs to this much longer archaeological landscape. Not far away stands the Midhow Chambered Cairn, a Neolithic burial monument. This means that people had already considered this part of Rousay important thousands of years before the Broch was constructed. Different generations repeatedly returned to the same landscape. The name Midhow is itself relatively modern. The archaeological monument is much older than the name suggests. Its original builders left no written record explaining what they called the structure, or what role it played within their society. The people who built Brochs were part of the Iron Age communities of northern Scotland. They lived in a world of local territories, farming, fishing, craft production, and regional exchange. They were not isolated from the wider world. Archaeological discoveries from Orkney show connections with distant regions, imported objects, different styles of pottery, and other materials demonstrate that communities across northern Britain were exchanging goods and ideas. Midhow existed within this wider network. The stone construction also required considerable planning. Large quantities of local stone had to be gathered, sorted, transported, and carefully positioned. The builders needed to understand how the walls would support themselves, how the internal galleries would fit together, and how the staircase could pass through the structure. The result was an architectural system that still impresses today. The walls may be ruined, but their basic design remains obvious. You can see the spaces inside the walls, follow sections of the internal passage, and understand how the central tower was organized. Eventually, the Broch ceased to function in its original form. The reasons are unknown. The building may have been abandoned gradually, or its role may have changed as the surrounding society changed. Later people continued using the site, leaving additional traces behind. Over centuries, the roof disappeared, upper sections collapsed, and vegetation spread across the stone. The sea continued to erode the coastline nearby. The structure survived, but increasingly as a ruin. Today, Midhow is protected as an important archaeological monument. A modern shelter helps protect the remains from the harsh Orkney weather. Without protection, wind, rain, and frost could gradually damage the ancient stonework. Standing inside the ruins, it is easy to appreciate the scale of the original structure. The walls surround you, the passages disappear into the stone, and the sea is visible beyond the ancient settlement. The environment has changed remarkably little. That is perhaps what makes Midhow so powerful. The building is ruined, but its relationship with the landscape remains. The same coastline, the same surrounding islands, and the same open skies are still visible. The Maya cave filled with ancient drawings. Deep beneath the forests of northern Guatemala, a narrow entrance leads into a cave unlike most archaeological sites. Inside, the walls are covered with drawings, human figures, Maya rulers, animals, symbols, and traces of ceremonies performed more than 1,000 years ago. This is Naj Tunich, one of the most important Maya cave sites ever discovered. Naj Tunich lies in the Patan region of Guatemala, near the modern border with Belize. The name is usually translated as painted house in the Maya language associated with the site. That name is fitting, because the cave contains an extraordinary collection of ancient paintings and inscriptions. The cave was not simply a place where people sheltered. For the ancient Maya, caves could have deep religious significance. They were associated with the underworld, water, creation, and supernatural beings. A cave could represent an entrance into another world. Naj Tunich appears to have been used mainly during the late Classic Maya period, roughly between the 7th and 9th centuries AD. During this period, powerful Maya kingdoms controlled much of the region. Cities such as Tikal, Calakmul, and Karakol competed for influence. But far from those monumental cities, people were entering a dark cave for very different reasons. The cave contains numerous paintings and inscriptions. Some are simple, others show surprisingly detailed human figures. There are scenes involving Maya elites, possible dancers, musicians, and ritual activities. The images provide a rare glimpse into aspects of Maya life that are difficult to reconstruct from monumental architecture alone. One of the most remarkable things about Naj Tunich is the survival of the paintings. The cave environment protected some of the artwork from the tropical conditions outside, deep inside. The darkness helped preserve traces of pigments applied directly to the rock. The ancient artists used mineral and organic pigments, creating red, black, and other colors. Some paintings have faded considerably, but enough remains to reveal the skill of the artists. The inscriptions are equally important. Maya scribes recorded names, dates, titles, and other information using the Maya writing system. These texts can sometimes identify individuals connected with the cave. That makes Naj Tunich unusual. Many ancient caves contain archaeological objects, but Naj Tunich also preserves written information. The combination of paintings and inscriptions gives researchers a much richer picture of how the cave was used. Imagine entering the cave during the height of its use. The entrance would have been surrounded by dense forest. Inside, the light would quickly disappear. Only torches or small fires would illuminate the walls. The painted figures would emerge from the darkness, appearing almost alive in the flickering light. The darkness may have been part of the experience. The Maya did not necessarily view caves simply as empty spaces beneath the ground. They could be sacred places connected with powerful supernatural forces. Entering one may have been a religious act. Water was another important element. Caves often contained pools or underground water sources. For Maya communities, water was essential to life. But it could also have religious significance, especially in a tropical environment where rainfall determined agricultural success. Offerings may have been placed inside the cave. Archaeologists have recovered pottery, human remains, and other evidence of ritual activity. Some objects appear to have been deliberately deposited. The cave therefore became a place where the physical and supernatural worlds could meet. People entered from the surface, moved through darkness, performed rituals, and left objects behind. The paintings remained as traces of those visits. Some of the figures may represent important individuals. Others could be supernatural beings or participants in ceremonies. Identifying every figure is difficult. Maya art often combines political, religious, and mythological imagery. One of the great strengths of Naj Tunich is that the paintings can be studied alongside Maya inscriptions from cities elsewhere. Researchers can compare names, titles, clothing, and artistic styles. This helps place the cave within the political world of the classic Maya. The site may have attracted people from different communities. The presence of elite imagery suggests that powerful individuals were involved, but ordinary participants may also have entered the cave. Its importance may have extended beyond one royal court. Eventually, the cave stopped being used in the way it had been during the classic period. The great Maya political system changed. Cities declined, and populations moved. The cave became quiet, but the paintings remained. For centuries, Naj Tunich was hidden within the forest. The entrance was known locally, but the wider archaeological world knew little about what lay inside. Then, in the 20th century, the cave was brought to international archaeological attention. The discovery created enormous excitement. Here was a Maya cave containing paintings and inscriptions in an unusually concentrated setting. Researchers began documenting the artwork, recording the texts, and studying the archaeological deposits. Unfortunately, the site also faced a serious problem. Once its importance became known, visitors began entering the cave. Some damaged the paintings, and parts of the site were vandalized. Ancient artwork that had survived for centuries could be destroyed within moments. Because of this, access to Naj Tunich has been heavily restricted. Conservation became more important than tourism. The cave is now treated as a fragile archaeological environment, rather than an ordinary attraction. That decision is understandable. The paintings are irreplaceable. Once pigment disappears from the rock, no reconstruction can truly replace it. Every remaining line can contain information about Maya art, religion, politics, or daily life. The horn-shaped fortress above the Andes, Huacrapucara, stands at an altitude of more than 4,000 meters above sea level, far above the valleys and settlements below. The journey to reach it is difficult. The landscape is steep, the air is thin, and the mountains drop sharply into deep valleys. Yet ancient people deliberately built and modified structures in this extraordinary location. The name Huacrapucara comes from Quechua and is commonly translated as something like horn-shaped fortress. The name refers to the two enormous natural rock formations that dominate the site. They rise dramatically from the ridge, giving the entire monument its distinctive appearance. But Wakrapukara is more than a natural formation. Stone walls, terraces, platforms, and carefully constructed pathways were added around the rock. The builders adapted their architecture to the natural cliffs, rather than trying to reshape the entire mountain. The exact origins of the site are complicated. Some archaeological interpretations connect Wakrapukara with the Kanchi people, a pre-Inca population of the Cusco region. Later, the site became associated with the expanding Inca state. This means that the monument may have existed before the Incas, then been incorporated into their wider political and religious landscape. The location would have been strategically useful. From the high ridge, a person could see across enormous distances. Mountain valleys, ridges, and routes through the surrounding landscape would have been visible. A settlement positioned here could potentially control movement through the region. But describing Wakrapukara simply as a fortress may be misleading. The site also contains features suggesting ceremonial activity. Platforms and carefully arranged spaces occur around the natural rock formations, and the dramatic landscape itself may have been important. The Andes were not simply a backdrop to ancient societies. Mountains, rivers, springs, and caves could hold deep religious significance. Important peaks were associated with powerful beings known as apuz, mountain spirits or sacred mountain powers within Andean traditions. A site built high among dramatic peaks could therefore have had religious meaning as well as practical importance. Imagine reaching Wakrapukara centuries ago. The journey would already have been demanding. You would climb through the highlands, crossing narrow paths above steep valleys. Then, the two enormous rock horns would appear ahead. Between them, the stone structures would become visible. The view from the site is extraordinary. The Apurimac River flows through the deep canyon below, while mountains stretch toward the horizon. The contrast between the small human structures and the enormous surrounding landscape must have been just as powerful centuries ago. The builders used local stone, creating walls that follow the natural shape of the mountain. Some sections form terraces, others create platforms or enclosed spaces. The architecture does not dominate the landscape. It seems almost to grow out of it. This relationship with the natural rock is one of Wakrapukara's most interesting features. The two horn-like formations were already there. The ancient builders recognized their importance, then added architecture around them. Nature provided the monument's central form. Human beings completed it. The site also reveals something about ancient Andean engineering. Building at more than 4,000 meters presented enormous challenges. Transporting stone, creating level surfaces, and constructing stable walls on steep terrain required careful planning. The workers also had to operate in an environment with cold temperatures, strong winds, and limited oxygen. Yet the structures were built. The people who worked here understood the mountain, the available materials, and the challenges of the terrain. They adapted their construction techniques to the landscape rather than fighting against it. The surrounding region was already densely connected before the Inca expansion. Different communities occupied the highlands, controlled territories, and interacted through trade and conflict. The Guanche were one of the groups associated with this part of the Andes. The rise of the Inca Empire changed the political landscape. The Incas expanded from Cusco, gradually incorporating neighboring communities into their growing state. Places with strategic or religious importance could be absorbed into the imperial system. Wakrapukara may have been one such place. But exactly how the site was used during the Inca period remains uncertain. Was it primarily a defensive position? A ceremonial center? A religious sanctuary? A high-altitude settlement? Or a combination of several functions? Archaeology has not provided a single definitive answer. That uncertainty is part of what makes Wakrapukara fascinating. The dramatic appearance makes it tempting to call it a fortress, but ancient sites rarely fit neatly into modern categories. A place could be strategically useful, while also being sacred. A political center could also be a religious one. The Spanish conquest eventually transformed the Andes. Inca political authority collapsed, new settlements and roads were established, and many traditional places lost their original roles. Wakrapukara became increasingly isolated. The high mountain environment helped preserve it. There was no large modern city built over the site, and the extreme terrain limited development. The stone walls remained among the cliffs, exposed to wind and weather. For a long time, the site was known locally, but it remained relatively obscure to the wider world. In recent years, Huaycarpucara has attracted increasing attention from archaeologists, travelers, and photographers. Its dramatic appearance has made it one of the most recognizable archaeological landscapes around Cusco, yet its importance goes beyond its appearance. The site preserves evidence of how ancient Andean communities used difficult mountain environments and how architecture could be integrated with sacred landscapes. Standing there today, it is easy to focus on the enormous stone horns. But look more closely, and the human construction becomes visible. Walls, terraces, platforms, and carefully positioned paths are built around the natural formations. The result is neither completely natural nor completely artificial. It is a combination of both. The mountain created the dramatic shape, and people transformed it into a meaningful place. The Greek city hidden beneath the Italian hills. Velia was founded by Greek settlers around the 6th century BC, when groups from the Greek world were establishing colonies across southern Italy. The region became known as Magna Graecia, a Greek-speaking world that developed across much of southern Italy and Sicily. Velia became one of its most important intellectual and cultural centers. The location was carefully chosen. The city stood on a coastal hill, with access to the sea, while the elevated terrain provided natural protection. From the upper parts of the city, the surrounding coastline and countryside could be seen for considerable distances. But Velia's importance was not simply military or commercial. The city became famous for philosophy. This was the home of the Eleatic school, one of the most influential philosophical traditions of the ancient Greek world. Its most famous thinker was Parmenides. Parmenides lived around the 5th century BC, and his ideas challenged the way people thought about reality, change, movement, and existence itself. His student Zeno of Elea became famous for his paradoxes, arguments that questioned whether motion and change were really as straightforward as they appeared. It is remarkable to think about this. On a hillside in southern Italy, a relatively small Greek colony produced philosophers whose ideas would influence Western thought for centuries. The city was not merely a trading settlement. It had become a place of intellectual life. But everyday life continued around that philosophy. People lived in houses, worked in workshops, traded goods, and traveled through the streets. The city had temples, public spaces, baths, and defensive structures. Velia was a functioning urban community. One of its most impressive features is the Porta Rosa, a monumental stone arch built into the hillside. The gateway is one of the best preserved examples of ancient Greek arch construction in Italy. Its purpose was practical, but its engineering is remarkable. The arch spans an opening between two massive stone walls, creating a passage through the hill. It demonstrates how Greek builders adapted architectural techniques to the steep terrain. Instead of creating a flat city, they built vertically across the landscape. The city was divided into different areas. The lower settlement was connected with the coastline, while the upper parts of the city contained important public and religious structures. Roads climbed the hill, linking different sections together. The higher you traveled, the more impressive the defensive position became. Large walls surrounded parts of the settlement, protecting the city from attacks. Some sections were built using enormous blocks of stone, creating powerful defensive barriers. Velia also had important religious buildings. Temples were dedicated to Greek gods, and later Roman religious traditions became part of the city. The archaeological remains therefore preserve several centuries of changing religious life. The city eventually became connected with Rome. Roman influence expanded throughout southern Italy, and Elea was gradually incorporated into the Roman political world. Its Greek traditions did not immediately disappear. Instead, Roman and Greek elements existed together. The city was eventually known by the Latin name Velia. Under Roman rule, its importance continued. Roads were improved, buildings were modified, and new structures were constructed. The city remained part of the wider Mediterranean world. One of the most interesting things about Velia is that it was never completely rebuilt into a modern settlement. As the ancient city declined, large parts of it were gradually abandoned. The hillside was left relatively quiet. Over time, buildings collapsed, roads became covered, and vegetation spread across the ruins. But the underlying city remained. Its walls, streets, gates, and foundations survived beneath the soil. The changing coastline also affected the settlement. The shoreline around Velia is not identical to the ancient coastline. Sedimentation and geological changes altered the relationship between the city and the sea. The place that was once a busy coastal settlement is now partly separated from the ancient shoreline. This is one reason archaeology is so important here. The ruins alone do not tell the whole story. Researchers also have to reconstruct how the landscape itself changed, and how those changes affected the city. Imagine Velia during its Greek period. Ships approaching the coast, merchants arriving from across the Mediterranean, citizens walking through the streets, and philosophers discussing questions about reality and existence. The city would have been small by modern standards, but its influence was enormous. The Eleatic philosophers were asking questions that still sound surprisingly modern. What does it mean for something to exist? Can something truly change? Can movement be logically explained? These questions were debated more than 2,000 years ago, on the same hill where the ruins stand today. Yet philosophy was only one part of the city's story. Archaeological evidence also reveals ordinary life. Pottery, coins, building foundations, burials, and roads all help reconstruct the community that supported the famous thinkers. Eventually, the city's importance declined. Changes in trade, political developments, and the rise of other settlements altered the region. Velia became less important, and parts of the city were abandoned. The ancient settlement slowly disappeared from everyday memory, but the name survived through historical texts, and the ruins remained scattered across the hillside. Modern archaeology eventually began uncovering the city again. Excavations revealed the enormous defensive walls, the Porta Rosa, temples, residential areas, and other public structures. Piece by piece, the ancient city returned to view. The ancient city carved into the Georgian cliff. High above the empty Kvari River, a rocky cliff rises from the landscape of central Georgia. But the most remarkable thing about this cliff is what lies inside it. Ancient chambers, tunnels, wine cellars, temples, living spaces, and entire streets were carved directly into the rock. This is Uplis-Sikhi, one of Georgia's oldest and most unusual rock-cut settlements. Uplis-Sikhi stands near the modern city of Gori, on a rocky plateau overlooking the Mtekvari River. The location was carefully chosen. The cliffs provided natural protection, while the river connected the settlement with the surrounding region. For centuries, people used this unusual landscape as a place to live, trade, worship, and eventually build a major urban center. The earliest occupation of Uplis-Sikhi dates back to the early Iron Age. Although the settlement developed considerably over many centuries, its greatest importance came during the ancient and medieval periods, when it became an important center in eastern Georgia. Unlike a conventional city, Uplis-Sikhi was built directly into the rock. Rooms were cut into the plateau, passages were carved between them, and large spaces were hollowed out beneath the surface. The result was a city that appears to emerge from the cliff itself. Some chambers were relatively simple. A doorway, a small room, and a bench carved along the wall. Others were much larger, with high ceilings, decorative details, and carefully shaped architectural features. The builders transformed natural rock into usable spaces. One of the most fascinating features is the network of passages. Some paths run between the rock-cut buildings, while others lead through narrow tunnels. Visitors moving through Uplis-Sikhi today can still follow parts of the ancient circulation system. The settlement also contained a theater. The presence of a theater shows that Uplis-Sikhi was not simply a collection of homes. It had public spaces, ceremonial areas, and buildings associated with communal life. Religion was also central to the settlement. Before Christianity became dominant in Georgia, Uplis-Sikhi contained pagan religious structures. Temples and ritual spaces were carved into the rock, reflecting the beliefs of the people who lived here. One of the most distinctive structures is the Hall of Queen Tamar. Although the name is traditional and does not prove that the famous medieval queen actually used the building, the hall has a large carved interior, with architectural details designed to imitate conventional stone construction. This is one of the interesting things about Uplis-Sikhi. Although the buildings were carved from rock, their architects did not simply leave them looking like caves. They added columns, arches, doorways, and decorative features, making the chambers resemble buildings constructed from separate materials. Wine was another important part of life here. Georgia has one of the world's oldest wine-making traditions, and Uplis-Sikhi contains large rock-cut spaces associated with wine production and storage. Some chambers contain stone presses, while others appear to have been used for storing wine in large vessels. The settlement, therefore, had an economy connected with agriculture and trade. People needed food, water, wine, tools, and other goods. Uplis-Seki's position above the river helped connect it with the surrounding countryside. The Mtakefari River was an important route through the region. Travel along the river connected eastern Georgia with wider networks extending toward the Caucasus and beyond. Uplis-Seki's position allowed it to benefit from these connections. Over time, the settlement became increasingly important. During the medieval period, it served as a major center in the region. Its position also became particularly valuable during periods of political instability. The cliffs provided natural defensive advantages, while the settlement's elevated position allowed people to observe the surrounding landscape. But Uplis-Seki was not completely isolated. It was part of a wider network of Georgian cities, fortresses, and religious centers. Its history was shaped by the same political struggles that affected the rest of the Caucasus. Christianity eventually transformed the settlement. Georgia adopted Christianity in the early 4th century, and Christian buildings appeared at Uplis-Seki. One of the most important surviving structures is a medieval church built within the rock-cut settlement. This created an unusual combination: pagan spaces, ancient rock-cut chambers, and Christian architecture existed within the same archaeological landscape. The settlement therefore preserves different layers of Georgian religious history. Uplis-Seki eventually declined. The rise of other political and economic centers reduced its importance, while changes in trade routes also affected the settlement. The city was gradually abandoned. Natural forces then began reshaping the ruins. Wind, rain, and earthquakes damaged the rock-cut structures. The Caucasus is a seismically active region, and earthquakes have caused serious damage to parts of Uplis-Seki over the centuries. Some sections of the ancient settlement collapsed. Others survived, carved directly into the stone. The result is a landscape where intact chambers stand beside broken cliffs, making it difficult to tell where human architecture ends and natural rock begins. For centuries, the ruins remained part of the surrounding landscape. Modern archaeological research eventually began documenting the site, revealing the extraordinary scale of the settlement. The stone model hidden in the Peruvian highlands. Sayhuite lies in the Apurimac region of Peru, at an altitude of more than 3,000 meters above sea level. The surrounding landscape is dramatic. Mountain slopes rise in every direction. Deep valleys cut through the Andes, and the air is thin and cold. Yet ancient people deliberately created a ceremonial site here. Sayhuite is generally associated with the Inca period, although the archaeological landscape around the site reflects a longer history. The Incas controlled much of this region during the final centuries before the Spanish conquest. They built roads, administrative centers, religious sites, and agricultural terraces across the Andes. Sayhuite appears to have been part of this wider world. The monument that made Sayhuite famous is known as the Monolith of Sayhuite. It is an enormous block of volcanic stone, roughly 4 meters across. Its upper surface is covered with hundreds of carvings. At first glance, they appear almost chaotic. But when you look closely, a miniature world begins to emerge. There are carved terraces, stairways, channels, pools, buildings, animals, and human figures. Some features appear almost architectural, as though the stone represents a landscape seen from above. Others are clearly symbolic. This has led to one of the most famous interpretations of the monument. Some researchers have suggested that the stone represents a 3-dimensional model of an Inca settlement or hydraulic landscape. Perhaps it was used to demonstrate how water should move through terraces, canals, and agricultural areas. The idea is fascinating, but it is not proven. There is no surviving Inca text explaining exactly what the stone represented. We cannot simply look at the carvings and know what the sculptor intended. The monument has to be interpreted through archaeology, comparison, and the wider landscape. Another possibility is that the carvings were primarily religious. The animals and human figures may have represented sacred beings, important communities, or elements of the natural world. The channels may have had symbolic meaning rather than being practical instructions, and there may be another explanation entirely. The monument could have served several purposes at once. Inca architecture often connected practical engineering with religion. Water could be essential for agriculture, while also having deep ceremonial significance. A model of water management could therefore have been both practical and sacred. The animals carved into the stone are particularly interesting. Researchers have identified figures that appear to represent creatures such as llamas, frogs, snakes, and felines. These animals were important within Andean cultures, and some were associated with particular environments or religious ideas. The frog, for example, was associated with water and rainfall in parts of the Andes. A creature connected with water appearing among carved channels and pools may not be accidental. But again, the exact symbolism remains uncertain. The monument also contains human figures. Some appear to be standing, others are shown in unusual positions. Their small size compared with the enormous stone makes them easy to overlook. Yet they may have been important parts of the composition. Imagine the stone when it was newly carved. The surface would have been much sharper, the figures easier to recognize, and the entire monument may have been part of a larger ceremonial environment. People could have gathered around it, performing rituals, observing the carvings, or perhaps using the monument to communicate knowledge. The wider site contains other carved stones as well. Some feature geometric designs, others depict human or animal forms. Together, they suggest that Sehuit was not created around one isolated sculpture. It was part of a broader ceremonial landscape. The location itself may have mattered. The Andes were understood through relationships between mountains, water, fertile valleys, and the communities living between them. A high-altitude ceremonial site could connect these elements. The Incas were also exceptional landscape engineers. Across their empire, they constructed agricultural terraces, canals, aqueducts, roads, and drainage systems. They transformed steep mountain slopes into productive agricultural landscapes. Sehuit's carved channels, therefore, have an interesting context. The people who created the monument belonged to a society that understood water movement extremely well. They knew how to guide streams, protect fields from erosion, and distribute water across difficult terrain. But there is no evidence that the stone was simply an architectural blueprint. That interpretation has become popular because the carvings resemble real landscape features. But the monument contains too many symbolic elements to make the explanation straightforward. Perhaps the stone was teaching something. Perhaps it was representing something sacred. Perhaps it was a symbolic landscape created for ceremonies. Or perhaps its meaning changed over time. The Inca world was not static, and the monument may have been understood differently by different people. The surrounding site also raises questions about chronology. Some structures may belong to periods before the final Inca expansion. Others may have been modified during Inca control. This means Sehuit may preserve several layers of Andean history. Eventually, the Spanish conquest changed everything. The Inca political system collapsed. Traditional religious practices were disrupted, and many sacred places lost their original functions. Sehuit was no exception. The monument survived, but the knowledge needed to interpret it disappeared. The people who understood its symbols were gone. The meanings of the carved animals, the channels, and the miniature structures became increasingly difficult to reconstruct. For centuries, the stone remained in the Andean landscape. Weather slowly softened its carvings, but the basic design survived. Modern researchers eventually began studying the monument, and its unusual surface attracted enormous attention. The giant temple of the Moshe Desert, Huaca del Sol, stands near the modern city of Trujillo in the Moshe Valley. The landscape is striking. The Pacific coast is extremely dry. Rain is scarce, and the surrounding mountains and desert create a harsh environment. Yet the Moshe transformed this landscape into one of the most powerful cultural centers of ancient Peru. The Moshe civilization flourished along the northern coast of Peru between roughly the 1st and 8th centuries AD. They were not a single centralized empire in the way the later Incas were. Instead, different Moshe centers controlled different parts of the northern coast. But they shared artistic traditions, religious beliefs, architecture, and a remarkable ability to engineer monumental structures. Huaca del Sol was one of their greatest achievements. The structure was built from millions of adobe bricks, sun-dried blocks of mud and clay, layer after layer. The Moshe created a huge stepped monument that dominated the valley. The scale is difficult to appreciate from photographs. The original monument is believed to have been roughly 340 meters long, with a height that may once have approached 40 meters. It was not simply a temple building. It was an enormous architectural complex. The construction required extraordinary organization. every adobe brick had to be produced, transported, and placed. Some bricks even carried marks that may record the groups or communities responsible for producing them. These marks provide clues about how labor was organized. Imagine the Moshe landscape nearly 2,000 years ago. Thousands of people could have been involved in construction, workers carrying bricks, craftsmen preparing surfaces, religious specialists conducting ceremonies, and officials organizing the enormous project. The huqa would have towered over everything around it. The word huqa refers broadly to a sacred place or sacred object in Andean cultures. So Huca del Sol was not simply an architectural monument. It belonged to a religious landscape. Its enormous size reflected the importance of the rituals and political authority associated with it. Nearby stands another major Moshe monument, Huca de la Luna, or the Temple of the Moon. Together, the two huqas formed the monumental core of the ancient Moshe settlement known as Cerro Blanco. The relationship between them is one of the most important features of the archaeological site. Huca del Sol appears to have had an important political and administrative role, while Huca de la Luna contains some of the clearest surviving evidence for Moshe ceremonial activity. The two monuments should therefore be understood as parts of the same urban and religious landscape. The Moshe were famous for their extraordinary ceramics. Their pottery often depicts rulers, warriors, animals, deities, and scenes from everyday life. These objects are especially valuable because the Moshe left no known writing system comparable to the Maya script. Their art, therefore, becomes one of our most important sources of information. The walls of their monuments tell similar stories. Moshe artists created elaborate murals, showing supernatural beings, warriors, prisoners, and ritual scenes. Bright pigments were originally used to make the images highly visible. Today, much of that color has disappeared. Wind, sun, and centuries of weathering damaged the surfaces. But at Huaca de la Luna, some remarkable painted reliefs still survive. They help researchers understand the religious world that surrounded Huaca del Sol. The Moshe also appear to have practiced ritual sacrifice. Human remains discovered at Moshe sites, including Huaca de la Luna, provide evidence of violent ceremonial practices. These discoveries have changed our understanding of Moshe religion, but it is important not to imagine the entire civilization as being defined by sacrifice. The Moshe were also farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, engineers, traders, and builders. Their society depended on complex irrigation systems that transformed the desert into productive farmland. Water was one of the greatest challenges. Northern Peru receives very little rainfall along the coast. The Moshe therefore constructed extensive canals, redirecting river water toward agricultural fields. This allowed them to grow crops in an otherwise extremely dry environment. The same landscape that made farming difficult also encouraged monumental construction. Adobe was readily available. Mud could be shaped into bricks, and the dry climate allowed those bricks to survive for centuries. The desert helped preserve the monuments, but the desert also concealed them. As buildings collapsed, wind carried sand and dust across the site. Vegetation was limited, and the enormous structures gradually became part of the surrounding landscape. Huca del Sol was eventually abandoned. The exact reasons remain uncertain. Environmental changes, political instability, and shifts in the Moshe world may all have played a role. The civilization itself gradually transformed and disappeared by around the 8th century. The monument also suffered from deliberate destruction. During the Spanish colonial period, parts of Huaca del Sol were badly damaged when a channel was constructed through the structure. This caused major losses to the ancient monument, yet enormous sections survived. The remaining terraces and adobe masses still reveal the extraordinary scale of the original construction. Even after centuries of erosion and damage, the huqa remains one of the largest adobe structures in the Americas. Archaeologists continue studying the monument, using excavation, architectural analysis, remote sensing, and research into the surrounding Moshe settlement. Each discovery adds another piece to the story. Perhaps the most fascinating part is that Huaca del Sol was not simply built once. Like many ancient monumental structures, it was probably modified and expanded over time. Different generations added new construction, creating a layered monument. This means the huqa contains centuries of history inside its walls. One generation built, another expanded, another repaired, and eventually, the monument was abandoned. The tomb with a corridor that faces the sunset, The monument lies near Valencina de la Concepción, just outside modern Seville. But during the 3rd millennium BC, this landscape was very different. Valencina was one of the largest prehistoric settlements on the Iberian Peninsula, covering more than 400 hectares. It contained habitation areas, pits, enclosures, and a remarkable collection of monumental tombs. La Pastora belonged to this enormous prehistoric community. From the surface, the monument would originally have appeared as a large earthen mound. Beneath it, a carefully constructed passage extended toward a circular burial chamber. The entire structure was hidden beneath the landscape. The passage is the feature that immediately makes La Pastora unusual. It stretches for roughly 40 meters, making it one of the longest megalithic corridors known on the Iberian Peninsula. The passage gradually leads visitors toward the central chamber, creating a long transition between the outside world and the underground space. The walls were constructed from layers of stone, while larger slabs formed parts of the roof. At the end, the passage opens into a circular chamber. The chamber itself is only a few meters across, but after traveling through the long corridor, the change in space must have been striking. The monument is usually described as a thalos, a type of prehistoric circular chamber tomb. Instead of a simple rectangular burial chamber, the builders created a rounded interior, with the walls gradually forming a monumental enclosed space. But there is one feature that makes La Pastora particularly fascinating. Its entrance faces west. That means the passage is oriented toward the setting sun, a striking difference from many other megalithic monuments in the region. The orientation may have been deliberate. Why would the builders choose the sunset? We cannot say with certainty. The direction may have carried symbolic meaning, perhaps connected with death, the end of the day, or the movement of the sun across the sky. But there is no surviving written explanation. The orientation, therefore, remains one of the monument's great mysteries. The builders could have positioned the entrance differently, yet they chose this particular direction. Whatever the reason, the setting sun may have been part of how people experienced the tomb. Imagine standing at the entrance thousands of years ago, as the sun moved toward the horizon. The long passage would extend into darkness, while the light outside gradually disappeared. Inside, the chamber waited beneath the mound. The monument was not simply an architectural experiment. It was connected with death and burial. But exactly how the dead were placed inside, and how the ceremonies were organized, remained difficult to reconstruct. Later disturbance has affected the archaeological deposits. Researchers therefore have to work with incomplete evidence. Objects recovered from the monument and its surroundings provide some clues. Archaeologists identified flint blades, pottery, stone beads, gold sheets, and other objects associated with prehistoric burial traditions. Among the most interesting discoveries were distinctive metal spear or javelin points. These objects eventually became strongly associated with the monument and helped researchers investigate the wider networks of metal production and exchange in prehistoric Iberia. The metal objects are especially important because they reveal that the people connected with La Pastora were not isolated. Metalworking was developing across the Iberian Peninsula, and communities were exchanging raw materials, finished objects, and ideas. The wider Valencina landscape was even more impressive. Other monumental tombs were constructed nearby, including Muturubilla and Montelirio. Together, these monuments created a huge prehistoric funerary landscape. This suggests that Valencina was not simply a village with a few tombs. It may have been an important economic, social, and ceremonial center. The scale of the settlement is one of the reasons archaeologists continue to study it. The people who lived here were farmers, craft workers, traders, and members of communities capable of organizing enormous construction projects. Building La Pastora required planning, stone extraction, transportation, and coordinated labor. The long corridor alone would have required considerable effort. Large slabs had to be positioned, walls carefully constructed, and the entire structure eventually covered with an enormous mound. The monument was designed to last, and it did. Thousands of years passed. The original community disappeared, the mound changed, and the landscape was gradually transformed. But the stone passage remained underground. La Pastora was discovered in 1860 during agricultural work. The discovery began a long history of archaeological investigation at Valencina. What initially appeared to be a prehistoric tomb eventually became part of a much larger archaeological story. Later excavations revealed more of the passage, and researchers gradually understood its unusual dimensions. What had first been partially exposed turned out to be an exceptionally long underground monument. The discovery also showed how much of prehistoric Valencina remained beneath the modern landscape. The ancient settlement extends beneath areas that have since been developed, meaning that archaeology continues to reveal new pieces of the prehistoric community. Today, the Dolmen de la Pastora can still be entered. The passage leads downward, the stone walls close around you, and the circular chamber waits at the end. The modern world is only a short distance away, yet inside, the atmosphere changes completely. There are no monumental statues, no inscriptions, and no names of the people who built it. Instead, there is only architecture, a long passage, a dark chamber, and stones carefully placed more than 4,000 years ago. Perhaps the most intriguing question is what the sunset meant to the builders. Was the Western orientation connected with the journey of the dead? Was it part of a seasonal ceremony? Or was the direction chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with astronomy? We simply do not know. But the choice was unusual enough to attract attention. The monument's orientation, its enormous corridor, its circular chamber, and the objects discovered around it, all suggest that La Pastora was more than an ordinary grave. It was a carefully designed sacred place. The hill fort hidden in the Scottish Highlands. Dunadir rises near the village of Inch in Aberdeenshire. The hill itself is striking. It stands above the surrounding landscape, giving anyone at the summit a wide view across the countryside. For people living here thousands of years ago, that elevated position would have been extremely useful. The earliest occupation of Dunadir appears to belong to the Iron Age, when communities across northern Britain were building fortified settlements on naturally defensible hills. These hill forts varied enormously. Some were enormous regional centers. Others were much smaller settlements protecting a local community. Dunadir appears to have developed over several phases. The most visible remains are the stone ramparts. Large quantities of stone were used to create defensive boundaries around the summit. Today, much of the stone has collapsed into low banks, but the original fortification would have been far more obvious. The builders took advantage of the natural shape of the hill. Instead of constructing a completely artificial fortress, they used the steep slopes as part of the defense. Anyone approaching the summit would have had to climb upward, while people inside the fort could observe the surrounding landscape. This is one of the advantages of a hill fort. The landscape itself becomes part of the defensive system. A steep slope can replace a wall, a ridge can become a boundary, and a high summit provides a natural lookout. Dunadir combines all three, but the site was not necessarily built only for warfare. Iron Age hill forts could have served many purposes. They could be settlements, places where local leaders lived, centers of political authority, or locations used for gathering and ceremony. The exact role of Dunadir remains difficult to determine. Imagine the hill thousands of years ago. Wooden buildings would have stood within the enclosure. Smoke would have risen from hearths. Animals would have been kept nearby, and people would have moved between houses and work areas. From the summit, the surrounding countryside would have been visible in almost every direction. The settlement may have been relatively small, but its position gave it importance. Control of a high point could help a community monitor movement through the surrounding landscape. People traveling through the region could potentially be seen from the hill long before they reached the settlement. Dunadir also preserves evidence of later occupation. The hill was not simply abandoned after the Iron Age. A Pictish fort was established here during the early medieval period, adding another chapter to the history of the site. The Picts were the peoples who occupied much of northern and eastern Scotland during the early medieval period. They left behind distinctive symbols, stone carvings, fortified settlements, and evidence of complex political communities. Dunadir became part of this later world. The Pictish occupation is particularly interesting because it shows that the hill remained valuable long after its original Iron Age inhabitants had disappeared. The same strategic location, the same elevated position, and the same surrounding landscape continued to matter. The later fortifications included substantial stone structures. Some sections were built using large blocks, creating powerful walls around the summit. Although heavily ruined today, the surviving stones provide evidence of a significant defensive installation. But the exact relationship between the earlier Iron Age fort and the later Pictish settlement is still being studied. Were parts of the older fort reused? Were new walls constructed over earlier ones? And did the later inhabitants remember anything about the people who had occupied the hill centuries before? These questions are difficult to answer. There are no written records from the original Iron Age community, and Pictish written evidence is extremely limited. Much of the story has to be reconstructed from archaeology. The hill itself provides some clues. The remains of ramparts, stone structures, and archaeological deposits reveal repeated occupation. Different communities recognize the value of the same place, returning to the summit across many generations. The surrounding landscape was also important economically. People could farm the lower ground, raise livestock, and use the hill as a protected settlement. The fort did not exist separately from the countryside. It was part of a larger agricultural landscape. The construction itself required significant labor. Stone had to be collected, transported uphill, and arranged into defensive walls. The builders had to understand the terrain, choosing where walls would provide the greatest advantage. Yet the result was not a perfect fortress in the modern sense. The walls were never enormous stone castles. There were no towers like those of medieval Europe. Instead, Dunadir represents a much older form of defense, one based on elevation, stone ramparts, and control of access. Over time, the site eventually lost its importance. Political centers changed, communities moved, and new forms of settlement developed across Scotland. The fortifications gradually fell apart. Grass grew across the stone, rain washed soil into the ruined walls, and the hill slowly returned to the surrounding landscape. From a distance, the ancient fortress became almost invisible.